The significance is probably to do with two things. It's firstly the rarity of the manuscript itself. It's a physically very rare object. In fact, it only exists in one place. It's a one-off manuscript, or a unicum, kept in Tehran, in a library there. And that makes it peculiarly precious, because Shahrastani is rather a major figure in medieval Islamic thought, and particularly in his period. So it's highly unusual to have only one copy of a text by such an author. And the other thing which I think makes it very valuable is the intellectual content of the commentary, the core of which is almost certainly an Ismaili system of Quran interpretation. But aside from its its affiliation and those questions of how we categorize it, it is a very elegant system of ideas, a lost treasure. Shahrastani was a major luminary of the Seljuk period, so we're talking about the 11th century CE, 6th century Hijri. He is best known, he's probably in some ways world famous as an author of a major study of religious doctrines across the spectrum, and also philosophical teachings. The Kitab al-Milal is its name. But he was also famous in his own day as an authority in mainstream Sunni theology, Ash'arism. And he taught, well, he held a position for a while at the premier college of learning in Baghdad, the Nizamiya College, which was the first in a network of Nizamiya colleges which grew up. He also, later in his life, when he was living in Marv, in what is now Turkmenistan, became close to the Seljuk ruler, Sultan Sanjar. So he was quite a prominent figure, but more recently a series of works by Shahrastani have come to light and been studied more, which reveal that at some point in his life he inclined to and probably became affiliated with Nizari Ismailism, and the Quran commentaries are a major piece of evidence for that affiliation. Well, the historical context, the Seljuk period, it's a period in which really Sunnism was reasserting itself both intellectually and politically, after a period in which various forms of Shi'ism had been predominant in one way or another. And but Shi'ism, of course, lived on in that milieu, and that is actually represented in Shahrastani's own rather complex religious identity. I mean, he was publicly Sunni, but privately inclined to Shi'i and Ismaili views. So that particular complexity is very much in evidence in his own life story. But I think there's a deeper intellectual issue in his day. I mean, in a way it's an issue which characterizes the whole of, it's a big statement, but the whole of Islamic intellectual history involves a kind of tension between reason and revelation, and the interplay between those two polarities. And this enters a decisive phase, this negotiation, in the post-Ibn Sina period. Ibn Sina, the great philosopher who died in 1037. And basically, I think a lot of people, the more probing intellects in Shahrastani's generation, were involved in negotiating the impact of Ibn Sina. And one of the things you find in Ibn Sina is an accommodation of religion, of Islam. He's particularly exercised by explaining things like prophecy and eschatology, the data of the afterlife, in philosophical terms. But for many of Shahrastani's contemporaries, his accommodation, Ibn Sina's accommodation of religion, is too weak. He sees it basically as a kind of oblique, popular manifestation of truth proper to philosophy. So it's the poor cousin of philosophy. And people like Shahrastani, I think, wanted religion to have a much stronger rational probity. And in Shahrastani's case, what I feel actually was going on was a desire for religion and philosophy to merge. So he wants philosophy to have a religious authority or a prophetic authority, and he wants religion to become more philosophical. And he discovers this kind of merging of the two impulses in Ismailism. This really is what leads him, I think, to Ismailism. It is definitely, it has a very specific hermeneutical system at its core. He presents that system in some detail in different chapters of his 12-chapter introduction, and he then applies it quite systematically to each consecutive verse of the Quran, starting with the opening chapter. It's a system which involves what I call a lattice or a framework of complementary concepts. The key ones are creation and the command, the Logos command, al-khalq wal-amr. Then he has a concept of universality and specificity, which he actually takes through many degrees, at least 4 degrees between the absolutely universal and the absolutely specific. Then hierarchy and opposition or contrariety, another very important pair in this lattice of complementarities. And finally, in the most important complementarities, one would have to list the unfolding, al-musta'naf, and the accomplished, al-mafrugh anhu. And just to say how this methodology might work, taking the last polarity as an example, the polarity of the accomplished and the unfolding is traced by Shahrastani to a prophetic saying in which the Prophet is said to have heard Abu Bakr and Omar, the great companions, arguing about something, and he comes out and asks them what's going on, and they say they're arguing about predestination. Al-Qadar. Are we free in our action, or is everything known in advance by God? And the Prophet says that they must think in terms of a great angel. He says that reality is a great angel, but it's a paradoxical angel. Is paradoxical because of its constitution. It's half ice and half fire. But the ice doesn't extinguish the fire, and the fire doesn't melt the ice. Instead, it continuously praises God for maintaining it in existence. So this image of the great angel allows the Prophet to transcend the apparent contradiction of free will and determination. And for Shahrastani, it's a great key both to understanding the Quran and understanding key issues of philosophy, and particularly the philosophy of action. So in the case of the Quran, just to give you an example, he says that verse 5 of the opening chapter, it is you who we worship and it is you we ask for help. إِيَّاكَ نَعْبُدُ وَإِيَّاكَ نَسْتَعِينُ. Shahrastani says that the first half of that verse, it is you whom we worship, is an implicit acknowledgement of our free agency. We are worshipping God. We are performing actions either meritorious or demeritorious. So on the level appropriate to our existence, we are free. We are worshipping God. But we are also asking God for assistance insofar as we are completely dependent on God, whether we formulate that dependence in terms of God's foreknowledge or prevenient grace of some kind in allowing us to act. So the second half of the verse is rooted in the dimension of the accomplished. So both the unfolding and the accomplished dimension is acknowledged in verse 5 of the Fatiha. But going back to this idea of the merging of philosophy and religion, of course, for Shahrastani, in the domain of philosophy, or rather Kalam thought, the determinists, the Jabariya, fixate on the dimension of the accomplished to the detriment of the dimension of the unfolding. And the Qadariya, the proponents of absolute free will, fixate on the dimension of the unfolding to the detriment of the dimension of the accomplished. So you can see how these sorts of concepts are used by Shahrastani both in a philosophical context and in the interpretation of scripture. Well, he claims, of course, to receiving this whole system, this complex system of ideas, on the authority of the Prophet's household, the Ahl al-Bayt, and he's very emphatic about that in the Quran commentary. He actually describes at the beginning of the introductions how he was sort of convulsed by a quest for knowledge and the solution to how to understand the Quran, and this quest led him to a great teacher who he leaves anonymous. He doesn't disclose the identity of the teacher, presumably because of discretion, but he equates the teacher with Al-Khidr, the green one, the immortal sage referred to in the Quran. So he seems to have been some Ismaili authority. In terms of the details of the Quran commentary, probably one of the most decisive things in establishing its Ismaili complexion is his commentary on Quran chapter 2, Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 34, which is about the devil's refusal to obey the divine command and prostrate to the primordial human being, Adam. And for Shahrastani, all religious errors are rooted in this archetypal act of rebellion on the part of Iblis. And he equates Adam with the archetype of the Imam. He calls him the Mutawassit al-Amr, or the mediator of the divine command, etc. And what's very intriguing is that he seems to categorize the Twelver Shia, who he calls the expectant Shia, Shia al-Muntazira, because they're waiting for the Imam in occultation. He categorizes them with the Sunnis in refusing to acknowledge the person he calls Al-Imam Al-Hadir Al-Hayy Al-Qa'im, the present, living, current Imam. So it seems impossible not to interpret this as evidence of Shahrastani's Ismailism. Well, he does have a distinctive concept of the Quran, although of course it's related to esoteric ideas about the Quran that you might find in other sectors such as Sufism. But it really goes back to Shahrastani's primary complementarity, creation and the command, al-khalq and al-amr. The Quran really for Shahrastani comes down to the existentializing logos, the statement kun, be, kun in Arabic, through which God creates everything. So in some mysterious way, some mystical way, I think we have to say, the Quran is identified with the logos which any creative activity on God's part presupposes. So the Quran is actually, in some mysterious way, presupposed by creation. And this leads Shahrastani to a very minute sensitivity to the details of the text. Whether a verse comes between two other verses, whether there's a significance in that kind of sequence, even the shape of Arabic letters, the use of certain Arabic letters in certain verses. And an example of that is another aspect of his discussion of verse 5 of the opening chapter, which I've already mentioned. It is you we worship and it is you we ask for help. إِيَّاكَ نَعْبُدُ وَإِيَّاكَ نَسْتَعِينُ. He says that is the verse of self-submission, taslim. And he says that there are actually two decisive moments in spiritual terms in the life of a intelligent, sentient being, such as ourselves. One is the moment of being projected into existence, ijad, and the second is the moment of self-submission to God, taslim. And he says that both moments are associated with influxes of light, divine light. And he then mysteriously says that Kaf and Nun, the Arabic letters Kaf and Nun, are the trigger for both eruptions of light. What does it mean? Well, in the case of the projection into existence, it's clearly a reference to kun, be. In relation to taslim, it's more mysterious and more obscure, but what emerges is that the two criteria, taslim is about the free acknowledgement of God's existence, and so that splits into two things. There are two criteria: freedom and acknowledging. It's a free acknowledgement of God's existence. And he says that the Kaf and Nun of verse 5 of the opening chapter fulfill both those criteria, because the Kaf is the second person singular pronominal suffix. Iyaka, it's called the Kaf al-Khitab, the Kaf of direct address. It is you. It's an acknowledgement that you're actually in the presence of the addressee. And the na inflection of na'budu, it is you we worship, the first person plural inflection of the imperfect, is an acknowledgement that we are doing this, we are the agents of this acknowledgement. So both criteria of taslim are fulfilled in different ways by the Kaf and the Nun of the. It's very elaborate and extraordinary. There are various ways of answering that question of its modern relevance. I mean, the first and in a way the most obvious thing is that it is all about ta'wil. It's a classic example of hermeneutic interpretation in medieval Islam, and that has to be relevant today, where religion, Islam in particular, is negotiating modernity. Anything which can show the rich traditions in Islam of interpretation have to be relevant in a situation in which religion is negotiating modernity, because they demonstrate the pliancy of the tradition and its intellectual depth. In more sort of detailed terms, I mean, for example, Shahrastani has a rather involved discussion of abrogation, which introduces the whole issue of pluralism, the plurality of religious civilizations. And in other words, he's not just talking about the abrogation by a later Quranic verse of an earlier Quranic verse, but the relationship between the Quran and earlier scriptures. And what's extraordinary about that discussion is that Shahrastani actually inverts the conventional understanding of abrogation. It's not actually for him about a later revelation negating an earlier revelation, but affirming an earlier revelation. So he turns it in, his model is affirmative, not negative, in regard to other traditions. And he actually says, never say that one divine system, Sharia min ash-shara'i, is negated, or that its injunctions are annulled and others are laid down. So it's actually, in a way, a very radical concept of abrogation, which fully accommodates other traditions. I think the deepest answer, probably, to the question of its relevance, the relevance of the commentary in contemporary terms actually comes down to the thing that I mentioned before, which is the underlying impulse Shahrastani has to merge the religious and philosophical truths. I mean, you can see that his discussion of Ibn Sina's philosophy in Wrestling with the Philosopher, Struggling with the Philosopher, as it was published by the Institute, is the obverse of the system of hermeneutics that he's applying to the Quran. It functions both in questions of philosophy and cosmology, etc., and in questions of scriptural interpretation. And I think what that connects up with nowadays is the gathering discourse, which is trying to coordinate and even pull together religion and science. I think he foreshadows that discourse in the 12th century.